Welcome to Family History Mysteries, a podcast that tells the stories uncovered through family history research, the unexpected stories of everyday people. I am an avid family historian who has been compiling my family tree for over 15 years, with nearly 20,000 people recorded in my trees. And please put a review on my podcast. That will certainly help in getting the word out there and creating more listenership. Episode 292, Professor Chapman, Part 1. In May 1934, Professor Henry Chapman died suddenly at work. He was the Director of Cancer Research at the University of Sydney. A petition for the administration in bankruptcy of the estate was lodged by the Royal Society of New South Wales. It was alleged that Chapman's estate was indebted to the Society to the sum of £3,360, and that while Chapman was honorary secretary, he misappropriated funds and securities of the Society. So who was Professor Chapman and what led to him embezzling his employer? Henry George Chapman was a professor of physiology who was born on the 13th of January 1879 at Ealing, Middlesex, England, to Henry Chapman Sr. and Mary Ann Ryder. His father was a solicitor's clerk and he had a younger sister, Avis Mary Chapman. In about 1886, he emigrated to Melbourne. He was educated at Hawthorn College and then Ormond College, in which he received a scholarship to study at the University of Melbourne, which he received an MB in 1899 and a BS in 1900. He then attended the University of Adelaide and received an MB in 1901, where he was acting professor of physiology later on. He also received his MD in 1902 at the University of Melbourne, in which he won the Beanie Scholarship in 1899 and the McBain Scholarship in 1901. He graduated with first-class honours and excelled in anatomy, physiology and pathology. He was described as a tall, ruggedly good-looking man with a dominant personality. When he went to Adelaide as a fully qualified MD, his sister seems to have accompanied him to South Australia. In June 1934, it says that sincere sympathies extended to Miss Avis Chapman of Burnside, who's a prominent member of the Catholic Women's League and of the Guild for Social Studies, on the bereavement which she suffered for the death of her brother, Professor Henry George Chapman. When she was 47, she lived at Ludlow in Park Hill Road in Kew, Victoria. Avis died unmarried on the 21st of July 1959 in South Australia at the age of 79. When she died in South Australia in 1959, there was an inquest into her death, and Gordon James Bowring Pridham, who was her accountant of Erindale, South Australia, stated that the deceased has been known to me for many years, firstly teaching my children music, and in later years her visitations monthly to my home, always on the fourth Wednesday of the month. Miss Chapman has been under an eye specialist for failing eyesight. She in fact wore heavily lensed glasses and had done so for years, and had been told that nothing could be done to better her eyesight. The deceased was a woman of 5 foot 8 inches tall and usually wore dark clothing. She was almost notorious for walking, or should I say shuffling, along the road. Her paces were of a maximum of 6 inches, and she always moved along the centre of the road, and it was always said of her, the old lady who walks on the road, in making reference to her. It is a fact that she would always walk on the road, slap bang in the middle, irrespective of what traffic was about. It was a month ago today that I challenged her on the habit of walking along the road, and in justification of her actions, she explained that the road was better for walking and that she did not have to contend with gutters, shadows from trees and uneven surfaces, and that there was better lighting to assist her in her failing eyesight. A policeman also made a report for the coroner. There was an accident at the corner of Watson Avenue and Port Rush Road in Rose Park. When I arrived at the accident, the St John ambulance was in attendance and I saw the body of a woman lying in a supine position in the middle of Port Rush Road, and a truck stationary in the middle of Port Rush Road from where the body was lying faced in a northerly direction. The woman involved in the accident appeared to be injured badly. Mrs. Stella Tillier, who resided in Watson Avenue, said that she last saw Miss Avis Mary Chapman at 11:30am on the 21st of July 1959. She was in good health and appeared to be in good spirits. I've known her for 4 years, and for the past 2 years she's lived with me in my house. She wore very thick bifocal glasses and was nearly blind. I expected something like this to happen because she would walk down the centre of the road, as she was frightened to walk on the footpaths because of the guttering. And it did state that there were relatives in Cooma, New South Wales, that had been notified of her death. So back to Henry. He returned from Adelaide to the University of Melbourne in 1902 as a demonstrator in pathology, and then by 1903 was back in South Australia, where he married Julie Adelaide Elizabeth Ramsay Cox in Walkerville on the 30th of December 1903. Julie was also born in England. Their marriage was announced in the Adelaide Register on the 7th of January 1904. At St Andrew's Church, Walkerville, Henry George Chapman, MD of Sydney, only son of Henry Chapman, Esquire, solicitor of Melbourne, to Julie Elizabeth Adelaide Ramsay, youngest daughter of Julia and the late Henry Ramsay Cox, Esquire, formerly of Folkestone, Kent. For a number of years, Henry and Julie lived in the harbour suburb of Mossman on Sydney's lower North Shore, and this is where their 3 children were born, 2 girls and a boy. On the 14th of April 1917, the Melbourne Australasian said that Dr. Henry George Chapman has just been elected President of the Linnean Society of New South Wales. He's a graduate of the Melbourne University and the first graduate of an Australian university to become President of the Linnean Society of this state. From 1903 to 1913, Chapman was a lecturer and a demonstrator in physiology at the University of Sydney and was awarded the David Syme Research Prize by the University of Melbourne in 1910. In 1907, he was appointed Honorary Pathological Chemist at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital. At some point, they moved to the Blue Mountains to a house that they called Hiawatha in Blackheath. Chapman still found time for an active role in the community of Blackheath. He became patron of the local horticultural society and gave an address each year at the local primary school during Education Week. In about 1916, he separated from his wife and he resided from then at the University Club in Sydney, also maintaining flats in the city and at Bondi. From 1913 to 1918, he was Assistant Professor of Physiology under Sir Thomas Anderson Stewart and became a Professor of Pharmacology in 1918 and succeeded Stewart's chair in 1921. Chapman had a flair for networking and established a strong interest in public health and its connection to industry. He made a name for himself and was often asked to consult or give evidence in industrial cases. He was an expert on toxins, and as early as 1908 he gave evidence before the West Australian Royal Commission into meat supply and the use of the preservative sulphur dioxide in meat processing. He was fascinated by biochemistry and plant products and possessed a sound knowledge of botany. Alongside Dr. Petrie, he continued to research vegetable physiology and plant poisons. His knowledge of yeast activity provided him the opportunity to offer a series of lectures on the technology of bread making at the Sydney Technical College. With Chapman as director, the college established the first practical school of bakery in 1916, which quickly gathered the support of the trade. He gave detailed evidence on diet to the Commonwealth Royal Commission on the basic wage in 1920. He was active in local scientific societies. He was the Honorary Treasurer of the Royal Society from 1912 and was Honorary Treasurer of the National Council and New South Wales branch of the Australian Chemical Institute from 1919 and State President in 1931 to 1933. He published his research into biochemistry and plant products in journals such as the Medical Journal of Australia, often with D.A. Welch and J.M. Petrie. His most useful work was as chairman in 1919 to 1920 of the Complex Technical Commission of Inquiry into the prevalence of miners' phthisis and pneumoconiosis in the Broken Hill mines. He was tall and craggy with a dominating personality, and he managed to win the confidence of the Unionists and the assistance of mine managers and companies despite a bitter strike. After reporting that the Broken Hill mines did cause industrial disease as a result of inhaling dust, he made strong recommendations for immediate measures, including compensation for all persons affected and a 35-hour week. He played an honourable and courageous part in settling the strike, doggedly refusing to divulge the names of the 251 men suffering from lung disease until the compensation was certain. In 1924, he visited England on behalf of the Australian Meat Council and in the next year attended the conference on the reorganisation of the Commonwealth Institute of Science and Industry. Whilst in England, he met Marjorie Lily Elizabeth Jackson. Even though subsequent records list her as Marjorie Chapman, I'm highly doubtful that they married. Going on public family trees, I cannot see a marriage certificate between them. After their relationship commenced, she also used the name Geraldine. Marjorie was born in England in 1903 and Henry was 24 years older than her. Henry sailed from London on the 1st of August 1924, bound for Sydney. Marjorie and Henry had a daughter, Sheila, in February 1925 in England. And in May 1925, under the name of Geraldine, her and Sheila are living in London. On the 31st of May 1926, Geraldine and Sheila arrived from London to Sydney. In 1926, the underwear and corsetry manufacturer Burleigh Limited commissioned the Sydney Medical School to undertake the world's first anthropometric study of women to determine more accurate body shapes and sizes for the designs of their corsetry and underwear. This project strongly influenced our standards of women's fashion and design. The team was led by Professor Chapman and they measured 6,000 Australian women. It was carried out from October 1926 through 1927, with measuring being done around the country in locations such as factories, seaside holiday resorts and Turkish baths. The payment for carrying out the project was £10,000, paid out in full from Burleigh shares. Another child, Geraldine Eva Chapman, was born in October 1926 in Monmouthshire, Wales. An appeal in 1926 raised over £120,000 for the university's Cancer Research Fund. After the successful British applicant had declined the appointment, in 1928 Chapman was made Director of Cancer Research. In his application, Chapman sought to continue his studies into the genesis of cancer in particular families, a study that he'd begun in England and had reported on to the Research Committee of the British Empire Cancer Campaign. Despite opposition from members of the science faculty who doubted his integrity and scientific status, and they distrusted his public image, he made little contribution to research. In 1930, a series of newspaper articles exposed bitter dissension within the Cancer Committee and some dubious aspects of Chapman's career. In the 1927 census in Liverpool, England, Geraldine, with Sheila and their daughter Geraldine, are listed in the census. In 1928, he presided over the physiology section of the Hobart meeting of the Australasian Association for the Advancement of Science. Another child, Patrick H.W. Chapman, was born in Monmouthshire, Wales, in July 1930. Interestingly, in the 1930 census, it lists Henry George Chapman of Blackheath, Professor of Pharmacology, with Julie Adelaide E.R. Chapman living at Blackheath also. Henry Rupert Chapman is listed, as well as Mary Gladys Chapman of Hiawatha at Blackheath. Henry is a Jackaroo. Meanwhile, Marjorie was living in Bulwark, which is a predominantly residential area in Monmouthshire, Wales, and drove a Rolls Royce. After Henry's death, they lost everything and the children were brought up in Dover. In 1939, Marjorie Lily Jackson is listed as single, living at Shelley's Hotel in Lewes, Sussex, England, and her occupation was a nurse. In later life, Marjorie lived with her parents, and Marjorie died under her maiden name, aged 77, in January 1981 at Henley, Oxfordshire. So Henry Chapman's death was the 24th of May 1934 in Sydney, New South Wales. His death was in the Sydney Morning Herald, Monday the 28th of May 1934, that Henry George Chapman, late Director of Cancer Research at Sydney University, beloved husband of Adelaide and father of Dorothy, Mrs. Ridley, Gladys, Mrs. W.S. Flynn and Rupert, aged 53. The Adelaide Advertiser announced his sudden death on the 28th of May 1934 from Sydney. Professor Henry George Chapman, Director of Cancer Research at Sydney University, collapsed on Friday while at his work at the university. He was born at Ealing, Middlesex, England, and was educated in Melbourne, where he took his MD and BS degrees and was the McBain Scholar in Biology of 1901. He was acting Professor of Physiology at the University of Adelaide in 1901, Demonstrator of Pathology at the University of Melbourne in 1902, and Lecturer and Demonstrator of Physiology at the University of Sydney from 1903 till 1912. In 1920, he was elected as Professor of Physics at the Sydney University, and 2 years later, as a result of the Archibald bequest, became interested in problems of cancer. He sat on the Commission into Miners' Diseases at Broken Hill. He was Chairman of the Royal Society in Sydney and associated with the British Association for the Advancement of Science. Later in the year of his death, problems arose over the finances of the Royal Society. As Treasurer, Chapman had been called on to provide the auditor, Mr. Mannell, with information on bonds held on the Society's behalf at the Union Bank. He continually delayed doing so, and when he was pushed, he sent the following letter. Dear Mr. Mannell, I greatly regret the delay in regard to the completion of your audit. My illness has unfortunately prevented me from finding the keys of the strong box at the bank, which seemed to have been mislaid some months ago. I shall take steps to get the authority of the council to open forcibly the box at the bank. With apologies for the trouble that you have been occasioned, I am yours sincerely, Henry G. Chapman, Honorary Treasurer. Despite Chapman's assurances, nothing happened. Early on the afternoon of the 25th of May, so the day of Henry Chapman's death, Mr. Manel and the other executive officers of the Royal Society took the matter into their own hands, and they met at the Union Bank of Australia with a locksmith. When the strong box was opened, it was discovered that several £1,000s worth of bonds were missing. On the 2nd of June 1934, in the Ipswich Queensland Times, there's an article titled "Scientists End Sensational Sequel." Sensational evidence concerning the affairs of Professor Henry George Chapman, Director of Cancer Research at the University of Sydney, who died suddenly in his laboratory last Friday, was given before Judge Lucan in the Federal Bankruptcy Court today. A petition for the administration in the bankruptcy of the estate was lodged by the Royal Society of New South Wales to the sum of £3,360, with a claim that he misappropriated funds and securities. An affidavit of Edgar Booth, lecturer in physics at the university and honorary secretary of the Royal Society, stated that Chapman for many years until his death was the treasurer of the society and had under his control funds and securities which included bonds of face value of £7,200. On several occasions, Chapman told him the bonds were in the custody of the Union Bank of Australia. On the 25th of May, he made inquiries at the bank and was informed that no securities were held on behalf of the society, and there was a black box labelled Royal Society. It was opened and found to contain bonds of face value of £2,940. In April last, he signed a cheque at Chapman's request for £100 in Chapman's favour. Chapman said the money was to buy further bonds for the society. He later found the cheque was cleared, but no bonds had been bought. Norman Cowper, of the firm Allen and Hemsley Solicitors, stated that on the 31st of May he interviewed Linton Palmer, a member of the firm of Joseph Palmer and Sons Stockbrokers of Sydney, and he was informed the witness had, between the 25th of March 1920 and the 27th of March 1934, had sold through his firm government bonds and stock to a total value of £43,600. Between the same dates, Chapman had purchased bonds and stock to the value of £7,073 and received payment by cheques of £48,200. In addition, there'd been dealings with Mount Morgan gold mining shares and other mining shares, but the total operations did not exceed £500. He had been informed by Sir George Julius, Chairman of the Australian National Research Council, that Chapman had been honorary treasurer of the council for a number of years and that important books dealing with the council's affairs in Chapman's custody were missing, and that a sum of £16,000 alleged by Chapman to be invested could not be accounted for. Cowper estimated that Chapman's assets did not exceed £2,000. A list attached to Chapman's will showed assets including £35,000 worth of Commonwealth bonds, but investigation showed that this was a mere bluff. His Honour stated that he would hear more evidence on Monday. The City Coroner is expected to hold an inquest on Chapman's death in a fortnight's time. The death certificate states the cause of death was unknown. Portions of the stomach were sent to the government analyst, but results of the investigations had not been announced. It is expected that the defalcations, which amount to £30,000, including £22,000 belonging to the National Australian Research Council and £8,000 to the Royal Society. Evidence was given by Detective Delaney that he interviewed the manager of the head office of the Bank of Australia Asia, who informed him that Chapman had two accounts with the bank, the total credit in which was not £100. The bank did not hold any bonds or securities on behalf of Chapman. He also searched Chapman's rooms at the University Club and a flat at St Michael's Flats in Hunter Street and one in Gunyell Flats in Bondi, of which he'd been informed that Chapman was a tenant, but he failed to find any securities there. At a garage in Old South Head, Bondi, he saw two motor cars in which he was informed belonged to Chapman. Witness further stated he'd examined private documents in the Cancer Research Office at the university, but they did not indicate that Chapman had any assets except certain furniture and shares. His inquiries indicated that the value of the deceased's assets, which he had been able to trace, would be about £1,250. Mr. Cowper said that efforts were being made to get in touch with the widow in order to obtain her consent to the estate being administered. He expected he would be in a position to proceed on Monday. And 2 days later in the Adelaide News. In Sydney, when the bankruptcy court sat today, it was announced that consent had been given by Mrs. H.G. Chapman to an order being made for the administration in bankruptcy of the estate of her husband, the late Professor Henry George Chapman of Sydney University. When the court opened today, Dr. Wattles said he appeared for Mrs. Chapman, who was executrix and sole beneficiary under her husband's will. His client, he said, consented to the order asked for. Up to the present, the government analyst had not found any trace of poison in exhibits forwarded to him after the original post-mortem examination, which failed to reveal the cause of death of Professor Chapman. On the 9th of June 1934 in the Port Pirie Recorder. From Sydney, the government analyst has completed an examination of the organs removed from the body of Professor Chapman, late of the University of Sydney. Though his report has not been made public, it is said that there are traces of 2 drugs found. The inquest has been fixed for Tuesday week. Amazing allegations were made before Mr. Justice Lucan in the bankruptcy court last week. The Royal Society asked for administration of Professor Chapman's estate, alleging he'd misappropriated funds and securities of the Society to the value of £3,360. In addition, it was stated by a Royal Society solicitor in an affidavit that he'd been informed that a sum of nearly £16,000, which had been alleged by Professor Chapman to be invested on behalf of the Australian National Research Council, was also missing. Evidence was also given of failure to locate the professor's alleged assets, exceeding £85,000, a list of which was attached to his will. This, it was stated, appeared to be mere bluff. And in the Adelaide News on the 9th of June 1934, from Sydney, some of the most worried men in Sydney today are the members of the Sydney University Senate. Only they know why rumours and well-substantiated reports against the late Professor Henry George Chapman were hushed up. Only they know why he was not dismissed from his position as Director of Cancer Research at a salary of £2,000 when he never did any research at all. But for the fact that Professor Chapman's affairs came before the bankruptcy court, it is possible that there never would have been an inquiry into his death. At first, the story of his collapse and death in hospital were accepted in good faith, and it was only because of the bankruptcy evidence that the theory of suicide arose. Sydney specialists now believe that the poison Professor Chapman took was an Indian drug which caused a sensation of breathing before the heart ceases to beat. It leaves no trace in the body and may be no more painful a way of committing suicide than by other poisons. But it is not so much the fact of suicide as the revelations threatened at the inquest, which are causing anxiety to the Senate. The inquest is expected to open up a host of suppressed grievances which have been simmering against Professor Chapman for years, but have been kept secret by the Senate and the Cancer Committee. It is known that the Vice-Chancellor, Professor Wallace, had a thick file of papers dealing with Professor Chapman's administration of the Cancer Department and reasons why some of his medical colleagues felt impelled to resign from that committee. In Macquarie Street are many bitter critics who say that to avoid a university scandal, the Senate hushed up evidence of startling professional misconduct by Professor Chapman. It is known that since November, Professor Chapman's not been near the university, and in 3 months, urgent letters and telegrams had piled up for his attention. They were never even opened, and among these was a request for his resignation. Although he ignored it, the Senate took no steps to compel him to resign. The Senate is not embarrassed by any question of cancer research funds having been tampered with. These were very strictly supervised, and all purchases had to be made by the university buying department. Evidence will be given at the inquest, however, that filed away by the Senate are certain charges which suggest Professor Chapman made indirect profits by recommending the purchase of inferior or higher-priced equipment from certain firms. And on the 19th of June 1934 in the Adelaide News. From Sydney. The story of dramatic efforts to save the life of Professor Henry George Chapman, Director of Cancer Research, who was found unconscious in his room at the Cancer Research Branch of the Sydney University on the 25th of May, was told by Dr. Alan Lilly, Medical Superintendent of Royal Prince Alfred Hospital, to the coroner at the inquest today. At 7:45 p.m. on the day of Chapman's admission to hospital, the patient's condition indicated a possibility of his being under the influence of a narcotic poison. This poison affects the respiratory senses. I would say that the deceased died from respiratory poisoning, but I would not be prepared to go further than that. The coroner indicated that if the poison was self-administered, he is entitled to inquire as to the cause of it. The evidence before me at this stage is definite that the deceased died from the effects of narcotic poison, but I have not come to any conclusion. Mr. Flynn said it would be better dealt with after the medical evidence had been completed. The coroner said there are three means by which the drugs could have been taken: self-administered, given by someone else, or accidentally taken. It remains for me to find out whether there is other evidence to show how and why. If self-administered, there may be a motive, and I think the evidence being tendered may be admitted at this stage. James Hall, a messenger, said that at 8:50am on the 25th of May, he saw Professor Chapman come out of Dr. Love's room, which was on the same floor of the physics building. The professor appeared to be in a perfectly normal condition. He was dressed in a dark grey sack suit, and the witness did not see him again until 9:15am, when on entering his room to leave 2 or 3 letters, and he addressed the professor. The witness saw him sitting in his chair with his head and left arm reclining on his desk. His position indicated to me that he was either asleep or unconscious. I immediately returned to Mr. O'Brien's office to acquaint him with the circumstances. I returned with Mr. O'Brien, who took action to have Professor Chapman removed to hospital. Terence O'Brien, Secretary of the Cancer Research Committee, said that during the 12 months before May 25th, the professor had often complained to him of heart trouble and had ceased to ascend the stairs to his room because of exertion affecting his heart. About 6 or 8 weeks ago, Professor Chapman told him that in the physics building a few days earlier he had a bad attack, which left him unconscious for several hours. When called to his room on the 25th of May, he assumed that Professor Chapman had experienced a similar attack. He did not notice any drinking utensils or bottles or anything of a similar nature out of place. Henry Rupert Chapman, Jackaroo of Blackheath, said he last saw his father alive on the 16th of May. His father then stated he was not feeling too good, that he'd had a number of heart attacks and had been unconscious for some hours on one occasion. I'm of the opinion that my father died of heart trouble. He was on the best of terms with all the members of his family, and we are of the opinion that he was a wealthy man at the time of his death, and also that he owned property. The next day in the Adelaide Advertiser, from Sydney. Remarkable evidence concerning the late Professor Henry George Chapman, Director of Cancer Research at Sydney University, who died on the 25th of May in unusual circumstances, was given today when the City Coroner continued the inquest into the professor's death. Henry Rupert Chapman, Jackaroo of Blackheath, son of the dead man, said that his father's life had been insured for 2 sums of £500 each. With bonuses, the policies were worth £2,035. Dr. Stratford Sheldon, Government Medical Officer, who conducted a post-mortem and later sent the contents of the stomach to the government analyst, said in his opinion death was due to narcotic poisoning. Edgar Booth, Lecturer of Physics at the Sydney University, said that in April he asked Professor Chapman, as Honorary Treasurer of the Royal Society, to have the balance sheet prepared and audited for the annual general meeting. Professor Chapman promised that everything would be all right. Printed copies of the balance sheet were presented at the meeting, which Professor Chapman did not attend, but the witness had subsequently been informed by Percival Minnell, auditor for the Society, that Mr. Minnell had not signed the audited balance sheet and that a copy had been liberated with his signature in type only to enable Professor Chapman to have copies printed. Mr. Minnell subsequently informed the witness that he had communicated with Professor Chapman in an endeavour to secure access to the bonds appearing in the balance sheet amongst the assets of the Royal Society. When the box was opened, the bonds had a nominal value of £3,940, with a few other papers of no intrinsic value. The balance sheet had shown bonds with a value of £7,200. Alexander James Gibson, Consulting Engineer and Honorary Secretary of the Australian National Research Council, said that some difficulty had arisen regarding the payment of research workers, and on the 6th of February he wrote to Professor Chapman, who was their treasurer, reminding him that a financial statement was required for the committee meeting on the 26th of February. He received no reply and wrote to the President, Sir George Julius, and the Executive Committee, pointing out that certain matters required immediate attention, suggesting the appointment of a finance committee. A committee was appointed and met on several occasions. On the 21st of May, a meeting of the Federal Committee was held. Professor Chapman objected to the proceedings on the grounds that the meeting was unconstitutional and that he was the person who should deal with the funds of the Council. The rest of the committee asked for an audit immediately, and Professor Chapman wanted it put off to the end of June. The question of the balance sheet of the Royal Society arose during the discussion in which a member of the committee urged the necessity of viewing the bonds held by the bank. Professor Chapman said he lost the key to the box and he threatened Sir George Julius and the witness with legal proceedings. The witness said the books of the council had not been seen since the 21st of May. They were in Professor Chapman's possession. New books had now been prepared and there was a deficiency, but the exact amount has not been ascertained. William Mannell, auditor of the Royal Society, whose firm are auditors for the Australian National Research Council, said that after the meeting of the Finance Committee, at which Sir George Julius had given definite instructions for an immediate audit, Professor Chapman called into his office and said, "Oh, Mannell, all this trouble in connection with the Research Council is just simply due to the fact that Sir George Julius and his engineers want to run the show." The witness added that he was present later when the box of the Royal Society was opened, the deficiency being £3,620, and the inquiry was adjourned until Friday. In part 2, you'll discover that there is a twist to this story, something that I don't think anyone expected.
If you are interested in sharing your story on my podcast, Family History Mysteries, please go to my Facebook page and send me a message. If you would like some assistance in filling in the gaps in your family tree to see what mysteries you solve, please get in touch. And don't forget, you can have early access to episodes by subscribing, and you'll also gain access to bonus episodes.